week 10 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I look to start this week. The first kicker, Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Boswell coming off bye, and he's been one of the best kickers and accurate kickers in all pro football. So the last few weeks before they went on bye, week 6 at the Raiders, 17 points. Week 7 versus the Jets, 14. And week 8 versus the Giants, 14 fantasy points. So this week, it's a tougher matchup with the Commanders where they give up the third least amount of fantasy points to kickers on the season. But we know with this Pittsburgh team, they stall out a lot in the red zone, and that's where Chris Boswell comes in. And he's getting 40, 50-yarders weekly, it seems like. So on the season for Boswell, in the 8 games he's played, half of them he's had double-digit fantasy points. And every game besides one, he's had 8 or more fantasy points. So he's putting up points at a great rate, is Chris Boswell. Like I said, one of the more accurate kickers of all time in NFL history, and he's on an offense that just has trouble pushing it into the end zone consistently. So he's definitely a start this week. The next start, Brandon Aubrey of the Dallas Cowboys. So if Dak Prescott more field goals they're going to settle for is his Cowboy team. And then he was struggling offensively as well, I believe, for the most part. So Aubrey, a kicker, where we know he could kick that football from anywhere on the field. And this season, it's been another great season for Brandon Aubrey, where he's had 6 double-digit fantasy games in the first 8 he's played this season, and his worst game of the year was 6, and everything else 9 or more. So this week versus Philadelphia, Dallas knows they need points if they want to stay competitive in this ball game. But like I said, with Cooper Rush in their quarterback, that's going to be more red zone opportunities where I think this Cowboy team stalls out, and they got to rely on the big boot of Brandon Aubrey. So we know Aubrey, he has unlimited range for the most part. We could kick it up to 65, 67-yard range. And this week in an indoor game back home in Dallas, where they know they need points, and they might trot him out there for a couple long ones. He's definitely a kicker to start this week. The next kicker, Kaimi Fairbairn of the Houston Texans. So Nico Collins returning to the lineup. It's going to be a big thing, I believe, for this Texan team. It could be in the red zone even more. But Fairbairn, another kicker this season, where he's had 6 games out of the first 9 double-digit fantasy points this year, and only 2 games under 9 fantasy points. So the opportunities have been there early and often all season long. This week, Sunday Night Football, I believe, is going to be a shootout versus the Detroit Lions. And the last couple games for Fairbairn, Week 6 in New England, 12. Week 7 at Green Bay, 12. Week 8 versus Indianapolis, 11. And Week 9 at the Jets, 9. So in this one, we know points are going to be put on the board. We know this Houston Texan team, they've lost 2 out of 3 now. They're trying to get back on track. And this week here, if they got to trot Fairbairn out there for long field goals, we know his range is up to 60 yards, especially indoors. So I think this week he's a solid start. The next start, Younghoe Koo of the Atlanta Falcons. So this week, a great matchup at the New Orleans Saints that give up the second most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And an indoor game is always a plus. And we know Koo indoors, he's way better than he is outdoors. And obviously, that's most kickers, I would think. So Younghoe Koo, back early in the year in Week 4 versus Saints, he had a big ball game, including a walk-off field goal with 20 fantasy points. So Younghoe Koo's got a big boot. This is an indoor game once again. And this Falcon team, they're playing great football, no doubt about it, winning 4 out of 5 ball games. So Younghoe Koo this week in a division matchup where he's had success versus New Orleans, definitely a start this week. And the 5th and final kicker I have as a start, Cameron Dicker of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Dicker, I know the last couple weeks the numbers have dropped off a bit for Cameron Dicker, but this week a great matchup versus the Titans. They're a bend but don't break team at times, and also we've seen games where teams have gone off and put up big points on the board. So Dicker this season, like I said, he's been solid for the most part, but the last couple weeks the numbers have definitely dropped off. Week 8, 7 fantasy points versus Saints, and Week 9 at Cleveland, 1 fantasy points. But this week back home indoors for this Charger team, great matchup with the Titans giving up the 7th most points. And Cameron Dicker and this team, they've stalled out a lot this season as well, where opportunities will be there in this home game for Cameron Dicker. So I think he bounces back. And if he was dropped in your fantasy leagues, I would add him off the wire if you don't have a better kicker option and put him in your lineup this week. So that's a few kickers I have as starts for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.